section number 2, and with section number 2 we are going to talk about everyone's favorite topic, and that is political correctness. See, and it's good to know it's the same wherever I go. You say the words political correctness and you just sort of have a collective sort of, no, not that. Now, interestingly enough, political correctness, would you believe, has its home of all things in Marxism? Yeah. So the word originally came into use, this is kind of fun, as a joke. And it was a joke in 1930s Russia. And what it was is there are two realities. There is what is correct, meaning true, and then there is what is politically correct, which very often means not true. Okay, so it'd be like this. The party in Russia, and again, you go to 1930, could say it is always sunny in Russia in July and 75 degrees. And they could say that while you are standing in the middle of a driving rainstorm getting soaked. Now, the true statement is what? It is not always sunny in Russia, right? That's the true statement. What is the politically correct statement according to the party? It is always sunny in Russia. Now, of course, put yourself in 1930s Russia. If you were to stray from the party line, then what actually happens to you? The gulag and the like. This does not go well for you. And so there was a contrast here between what is correct and what is politically correct. Sometimes, and this is kind of funny, of all things, our favorite atheist friend, Bill Maher, actually speaks very much against a lot of the woke culture, but understand even political correctness then has its home in Marxism. You have to keep everybody in line is a part of this. Now, so in other words, I put it like this. Political correctness could be defined as succumbing to the pressure to adhere to factually incorrect statements. Political correctness is succumbing to the pressure to adhere to factually incorrect statements. In other words, is it correct or is it politically correct? Okay, one is true and one is false. Now, if the chief ideology of the day is that there is the oppressed and the oppressors, what is the worst thing you could possibly say? Anything that might be perceived as being against the oppressed. That's like the worst thing you can possibly do. All right, you cannot do so. So you see, oh my goodness, he said something against women. Oh my goodness, he said something against someone who's not heterosexual. Too many to list. Oh my goodness, he said something against a minority. Those are the worst things you can possibly do. Now, are those things bad? Sure. Absolutely. But you notice in this culture, those things become the worst things you can do, by which then you could be fired, lose your job, whatever. And I get emails from all over the country on this matter. After doing the issues, etc. I get lots and lots of folks. And that's not just in school, that's very much in corporate America. Okay? Where this is the training that you get. Okay? I call political correctness, the other thing I just call it is bullying. I just call it bullying. And then what happens is then what's the problem is you're shutting down conversation. So let's say we have a problem. You ever tried this thing? Let's have a problem, let's talk about it and see if we can get to the bottom of it. Sound like a good thing to do? Sound like maybe a Christian approach to things? Let's sit down and talk about it and see if we can get to the bottom of this thing together. Does political correctness allow for that? It actually shuts the conversation down under the threat of punishment. All right? And this, again, finds its home in Marxism. Is what then transpires. And all these things are everywhere. Okay. Boy, I have so many stories on that. All right, but I want to go to lesson 6 here. And lesson 6 is where I'm going to start talking about this thing called critical theory. And I know you don't have this in your sheet. You're going to pick up on 7. All right, because I just need to do a little bit of an introduction. So there's a name up on the board, or the screen. His name is Antonio Gramsci. In other words, if we're going to talk about cultural Marxism, where exactly did this thing come from? Where did it come? Ideas just don't pop up out of nowhere. You know what I mean? They come from somewhere. They have to come from someplace. And generally speaking, it comes from a guy by the name of Antonio Gramsci. Now, Gramsci was alive, born in 1891. He, you might guess, was in Italy. And he was a communist. He was a follower of Marx, and grew up. And there was Mussolini. You remember Mussolini? And Mussolini, by contrast, is not the same thing as a communist. He was a fascist. And what do communists do? They're trying to overthrow the government. That's what they do. You wake up in the morning, let's overthrow the government. Sounds like fun. Then we can play some frisbee golf. Just whatever you want to do. So, wouldn't you know, Mussolini throws Gramsci into prison. Fascist throws communists into prison. Story as old as time. And you have this, and while he's there, he writes, this is very famous, called the Prison Notebooks. And what this is why Marxism failed. So, okay, let's say you're like Gramsci. You love Marx. You think Marx has put together the greatest thing that has ever come around. But then you look and you realize Marxism has literally failed wherever it goes. It doesn't work. All of Marx's predictions have not come to pass. How can this possibly be? And what you find is you're a Marxist in crisis. What do? His ideas are brilliant, but they seem like they're all wrong. So, while in prison, he came across this idea of why are they all wrong? What is stopping the revolution from bringing about the utopia? And he came to this conclusion. It's the culture. And a culture binds a civilization together with shared institutions. So, for instance, what are some things that would bring people together in a society? Things like your schools. Everyone sends their kids to school. They're all learning basically the same thing. A school should, in theory, do what? Bind a society together. What's another institution that might bring a society together? Church. Oh, church, of course, is going to bring a society together and just sort of hold it together, and you have all sorts of institutions, or things like this, the family, and a family unit and structure. These things, people, do families share the shared experience, if you will, of family, where you can talk about raising kids together, and things like this, that bind a society together. So if you want to bring about this revolution, to bring about this utopia, Gramsci's idea is that you need to attack and get rid of all of the shared institutions of society. You got to get rid of them. Because people, they bind people together. And Marxism needs to do what? Define, dehumanize, and... So he wrote this all down. You can read this. He wrote this. Here's what we have to do. We've got to get rid of this. You've got to get rid of the elements, the institutions that bind a society together. So I ask people, how many of these things, I'm going to read you a list, how many of these things do you feel like, if you will, are, quote, under attack? It's called, generally speaking, under attack, whether it be media, online, curriculum in schools, whatever it is. How many of you feel like the family unit might be under attack? Christianity. Acceptance of authority of any kind. Defined roles of men and women. The importance of personal responsibility and the rule of law. Sexual morals. Even things like patriotism and national unity. Shared traditions and holidays. All these things, if you will, bind a society together. And what you got to do is you got to tear these things somehow apart. All right. Do we have a question there? Did you have your hand raised? I'm sorry. Oh, see, now this is the thing. I assume that you're Lutheran. And as assuming you're Lutheran, it also means I assume that you hold perfectly still at all times. All right? If you so much as flinch, I'm going to call on you. All right? So just know that that's the reality. Okay, so this is what Gramsci wrote. Are you ready for this quote? And you don't have it in your book, but I got to read you this one quote. Socialism is precisely the religion that must overwhelm, some translations kill, Christianity. It is a religion in the sense that it is a faith, and it has substituted the consciousness of a transcendental God, that we believe in God, for trust in man, in his best strengths as the sole spiritual reality.
You want to repeat that?
I will. Socialism is precisely the religion, and I'll even put in the word kill, Christianity. It is a religion in the sense that it too is a faith.
Slow down, please.
It is a religion too in the sense that it is a faith. And I'll even shorten the quote, if I can do that. Can I shorten the quote? It has substituted trust in God for trust in man. And this makes sense, because remember, in order for this to work, you need all people to be able to be perfectly content and happy with their, quote, equality. So, in essence, one of the things, again, on a previous slide, and you didn't see this one, but we touched on it. Number 2, Marx's fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of man. Because he doesn't understand our nature. And by the way, Pastor Mummy reminded me this is recording, so I have to tell you, my daughters are awesome. But it doesn't mean they love sharing. That you have here, you know, they don't understand. And then everything goes badly. And what I think is very important here, when I gave that list of things like family, Christianity, acceptance of authority, does our faith in Scripture speak to matters like sexual morals, men and women? Do we speak to things like family? I mean, in other words, it's not just tearing down society, it actually is directly attacking elements of what it is that we believe as Christians. And here comes the best part. You're going to love this, especially you heard the quote of Gramsci. For Gramsci, and to some extent Marx, and although the cultural Marxists that follow, do you know what they identify as the number one obstacle towards achieving this utopian dream? You know what the number one obstacle that they identify as is? The church. They identify Christianity as the number one obstacle, almost to a man and woman. Now that's bad news, and it's good news. And the reason that is good news is because that also means that you are in possession of the solution. In other words, they understand us, and you're going to see, I'll have some videos. They get us. They see, boy, these things that the Christians believe are directly opposed to what we need to have happen. Well, that's good. That means that you have the solution. And I'm going to keep suggesting it has something to do with God has created and redeemed all people in Jesus Christ. And what Jesus did. And to bring that, is then applying that to how we treat and conduct ourselves towards other people, i.e. with love and truth and justice and the like, which is not the same as social justice and not the same as equity, that is the forced equality. Do you see here? If it doesn't make sense, it's a good time to ask a question. Yeah.
In their language, when they say church or religion, do they explicitly mean Christianity, or are they
Yes.
hostile to Muslims?
No, Christianity. And part of that is because a lot of this comes out of, Western civilizations. Gramsci was in Italy. What do you find in Italy? Yeah. Yeah, I've noticed that. I think Rome is there. I think the Pope might be there somewhere. You see this here throughout and the like. So I do appreciate, I'm sorry, I want to make a comment. I do appreciate the fact that though Gramsci actually just clearly states his goals, and here's the battleground, and it's for the hearts and minds of people. That's our Christian territory. Our battle is not against flesh and blood, Ephesians 6, okay, but against all the spiritual forces of evil. Yes?
I was just wondering, was he Roman Catholic at all, or brought up that way?
Do I remember that or not? Do you want to know something? I actually don't remember the answer to that question. I apologize. Yeah. I suppose we could look this up. All right. Other questions, something easier this time. Something easier. Something a little less challenging that we could get to. Okay. All right. Now, here comes the next problem here. He has a big problem. Okay, so here's a solution. And you can open up your thing to lesson 7 now, because I think you have lesson 7 printed out. Okay, so now here's where this gets fun. All right, so the problem is that you have these consensus-creating institutions in society, meaning basically culture. Good, I've identified the problem. All I have to do now is get people to hate all the things that they love. No problem. All I got to do is now just have people overthrow their culture and demand something different. That sounds easy enough, doesn't it? In other words, how do you go about doing this? I mean, it's one thing to say this is what we need to do. All I need to do to get back to Minnesota is build an airplane. Oh, that sounds great. Oh, good. Where am I going to get the parts for that? Is there an AutoZone around here? How do you do this? This is no small task. So this takes us to number 7. Okay. We printed out number 7, right? Okay. So in the last section, it says we discussed Gramsci's idea to overthrow the culture. And as opposed to Marx, what he envisioned was an army of intellectuals. So Marx wouldn't mind if you go get out, weapons of harm. Gramsci, by contrast, was overthrow the culture through an intellectual army. We're gonna infiltrate the culture with ideas. Okay, so it's different from Marx in that way. Had the same goals, but different means of achieving it. Okay, called it the long march to the institutions of power. And this is the first paragraph on page 33, lesson 7. In Gramsci's own words, in the new order, socialism will triumph by first capturing the culture. We have to get in certain places via the infiltration of schools, universities, churches, and the media, thereby transforming the consciousness of society. He actually states it. This is how are we going to do this? This is what we have to do. We have to get into these places, and that's how you change things. You want to change how a generation thinks, you got to be the one who's teaching them in school. You got to get in churches. You got to have control of what message they're going to be seeing in via media. This is how you have to do this. So, in 1923, you have followers of Gramsci's ideas. You have a number of Marxists there, Pollock, Horkheimer, Grunberg. Anyhow, they set up for the Communist Party the Institute for Social Research at Frankfurt University in Weimar, Germany. Now, here's the problem. In the 30s, these gentlemen were Jewish, they were atheists, they were communists, and they lived in Germany in 1930s. Is that a good place for you to be in Germany as an atheist, a communist, and Jewish in the 1930s? The answer to that question is no. And so they fled, and they took a little circuitous route, but they eventually landed themselves at Columbia University here in America. All right. Something called the Frankfurt School, and it's at the very bottom of the page. It existed as a think tank to corrupt traditional Christian values of Western culture with pseudo-values included under the umbrella term of cultural Marxism. Okay? If you go a paragraph above that, it says the new mantra of Marxists was change the Western culture and the workers would unite. Right? So they actually have an army of intellectuals that they want to figure out how to do this. Now the question on page 34 is how successful were they? He specifically stated his idea and desire to infiltrate and transform universities, schools, the media, and churches. Do we see evidence of this?
Yeah.
Well, in 2006, and I have polls between 2006 and 2019, and in those polls, anywhere between 18 to 25% of American humanity professors, you know, the studies of social, these sorts of things, not in the science department per se, but between 18 to 25%, depending on the poll, actually self-identify themselves as Marxists. Which means that when you send your kid to school, you have actually, if they're somewhere in the humanities, they have between a 1 in 4 and 1 in 5 chance of actually having a Marxist professor. How about that? That's, by the way, 4 different polls that I have. Now, and I would suggest that a lot of them are teaching Marxist ideas, whether they actually call themselves Marxist or not. Because a lot of people would not say that social justice is Marxist, and like they wouldn't identify that or know what this is. Okay. Very interesting enough, I just presented the South Wisconsin Pastors Conference, and I was on to talk about social justice, and they have a pastor there in South Milwaukee who's from Venezuela, is his home, or where he's from. And he stood up and talked about the story of Venezuela, and he talked specifically about the term social justice being used a couple decades ago. And if you know anything about Venezuela, and you know that now it's under communist, and he stood up there. all the pastors, to have somebody from Venezuela come and give us the history of that was really awesome in explaining what this does. It's specifically out of Marxism. Okay, so the other thing that happens then with this is coming out of school an activist. So the term that you become is not to become an educated person. You want to become an activist who is active in trying to then transform society to achieve what?
Social justice.
Yeah. Social justice is the arm of bringing about that then, quote, equality. Because you've already divided people, oppressed versus oppressors. Schools. Has anyone noticed this is a hot issue today? Especially with CRT in schools. Critical race theory, all it is critical theory applied to the matter of race. And I should have talked about critical theory a little better with you on the last slide. So this idea of how do you go about criticizing everything? The idea of critical theory is actually that you criticize all of the institutions that exist with the idea that if you criticize something long enough, people will actually grow to dislike those institutions and demand something different. Oh, you don't like that. Yeah. No, that holiday is evil. That holiday is actually oppressing people. You know, whatever it is. You criticize something long enough. In other words, I call critical theory, and I should have looked at this, I call critical theory, I call it the weapon of cultural Marxism. Keep criticizing it. And it takes its home actually from Marx, which championed the ruthless critique of everything existing, end quote. You have to, in other words, if you're going to get a revolution, you have to wake people up to the fact that you're suffering. You're suffering. And not just because you're sitting here listening to me talk. You're like legitimately suffering. And you have to convince people they're suffering and the things they love are bad. Church is not good. Church is bad. It's an oppressor. Critical theory, yeah.
And there's also a big push to know that you deserve something.
Oh, yeah, you have that as well. You deserve something sometimes based upon the fact that you are oppressed. Okay? Or you don't deserve something because you're privileged. It had nothing to do with any like of your actions. All right. So, schools. CRT, critical race theory, is simply critical theory applied to the matter of race. And the idea is that you have to see all of society from the terms of a racial power dynamic, oppressed versus oppressor. So I'm going to give you one that's not race. I'm going to just start with gender. My teachers, meaning in the public school district in Alexandria, Minnesota, where I'm at, they went to professional training. And in their professional training, this is, I even have a hard time. They were asked to ponder their sexuality. This is professional training. And then, now here's the thing. So you ponder your sexuality, and then you have to ponder the privilege and power your sexuality might give you in the classroom. So, in other words, again, it's about a power dynamic, Marxism, oppressed versus oppressor. And how does your sexuality give you then that oppressive dynamic as part of your training? Okay, and they tell me, yeah, I know. You kind of look at it and you kind of go, what? This is basically everywhere. This is basic. In the matter of race, it's much the same thing. It goes back to that chapter from the beginning where I talked about you're either one of two things. You're either privileged or you are oppressed, you are a victim. And either you have to raise up and fight against the power or you have to apologize for having the power. So I've had college students, at least three different universities, by the way, where a common assignment can be writing a letter of apology to whatever oppressed group you pick. So you actually have to write papers of apology. Now keep in mind, it's not based on what you've done. It's not even based on what you've thought. It's based on your group identity that has, remember, you are defined, you are dehumanized, and you are divided. You see how this then comes out time and time again. Let's see if you can get this. I have an example in my book that I didn't bring. Can we do some applied learning in a quiz? Let's see if you can get this here. I'm going to ask you to think like a Marxist. All right, let's see if we can do this. All right, so one of the stories I have is there's a professor, is at Ohio State University, still there from as far as I know. All right, and if you know anything about Ohio State, what are they like at Ohio State? It's Saturday, by the way. What are they like? Oh, they love their football at Ohio State. They dig their football there. All right, so COVID, the first wave of COVID was just coming to an end, and this very academic man, and in all honesty, when I read his article, he was kind of one of these guys that was like apologizing for liking football, like, you know, this should be an institution of learning, not for this barbaric practice of men running into one another, this sort of thing. But he wrote an article saying that it's good that college football is back. People can get outside. Everybody is divided. This, brings people back together. Start kind of the healing that we need. We're, on a team together, and we're just getting out and doing fun stuff again. He then had to apologize, write a massive letter of apology, because what he wrote was completely condemned as racist. Okay, all right, Marxists, help me understand, how was that what I call a puff piece article? How is that racist?
Most players are black.
Okay, which is kind of funny because by the actual statistics of the Power 5 conference, believe it or not, they're not. But yes. Okay, now, but why does that make a difference? Why? Help me understand why that's racist, though. He's not black, and he's putting the onus for healing society then on black people. And more than that, the actual college football game is seen as a power dynamic where white people are using black people for their entertainment. You're viewing all of society through a lens of a power dynamic. In this case, race. But it's not just race. CRT is just a subset of critical theory. So you go back to my other story with my teachers, that actually isn't even male or female privilege. We're talking about heterosexual privilege and power, where you're looking at the classroom as a power dynamic between heterosexuals and then those who are not. Do you see what I'm saying? All of society is a power dynamic. And that's how you look at these things. Now, it doesn't change the fact that many, of course, black athletes over the course of years fought for the right to be included. Okay, that the actual numbers, and I had to look this up and got the stats, that believe it or not, Power 5 conferences, that's, the Big Ten, which is, of course, the greatest conference of all time. Hey, we can agree on something. The SEC, the ACC, the Big 12, Pac-12, those major conferences. Actually, it's less than 50% of the athletes playing football are black. But the facts don't matter. They don't matter. Yes?
Don't forget America. Football's an American institution.
Yeah.
Oh, Yeah, and it really does bring people together.
Well, it's also sexist, because usually only men play it.
Yeah. You know, and why are we putting this on men? You know, women should be better at this, healing our society. But do you see what I'm getting at here? You're viewing all society, and that is a Marxist way of thinking, to see all society in terms of a power dynamic. Everything. So I'll give you another one. I had a professor wrote in. He actually wrote into Issues, etc. I was commenting then on something I was saying, which really was a bummer. I got this email through Issues, etc., this radio show. And how many of you are familiar with Issues, etc. at all? Some of you are? Okay. Well, what really bugged me is that he wrote about how something I wrote, and how he as a professor had to write a diversity statement as part of his application to be a professor. And he wrote how everybody is created equal and should be treated with love and respect. And I think he put in there something about, you know, even God. And they called him back in to ask him basically if he needed to revise his statement, because the statement he wrote was racist and oppressive. But the part that bugged me was that they took this off the air. His email started with the words, and I'm quoting here, "Pastor Dare was right." They didn't say that on air, and I'm like, come on! I'm like, Pastor, I never hear those words as a pastor. The best I've gotten ever was, I'll remember this till the day I die, it was 2 years ago. I was teaching in class confirmation, and there was an 8th grade girl, and she's looking at me, and she's kind of confused looking, just looking at me confused. And I called on her, and I said, "You have a question?" And she says, "No." She goes, but Pastor, what you just said was actually helpful. I'm like, take me now, Lord. I'm like, I've achieved it for the first time ever. I had an 8th grade girl tell me I said something helpful. All right. So I'm like, wow. All right. So you see, unless you acknowledge the power dynamic, then you are either sexist, racist, quote, a homophobe or prejudice against somebody who is not heterosexual. Unless you acknowledge it, you are those things. Because everything is looked at. I've already divided you. You are either oppressed or oppressor. That's it. And unless you get on board with that, you are in the category of you're candidly a bad person. Any questions or thoughts? Cheery, isn't it? Interesting enough, in regard to the schools, and there's all sorts of things with schools. Page 34, I think you have this there. You know, the first bullet point that you see, schools claiming traditional approaches to math education, including getting the correct answer, promotes racism and white supremacy. Insisting assignments be turned on time is racist. Objectivity is racist. I ask, are those, if you will, white values, or are those just actual values that you have to look at and the like? And then I did a very controversial one. I took the Derek Chovin trial, and to be very clear, it's at the bottom of the page, and I want to be very, very clear. This is not meant in any way to condone Chauvin's actions. I'm only commenting on the media coverage. Do we got that one? I'm only commenting on media coverage. Because remember, what did Gramsci want to do? He wanted to infiltrate schools, universities, media, and churches. That's the only thing I'm commenting on here, is the media coverage. That's it. All right, now, so at the top of page 35, I said, do you agree that the predominant theme of the media coverage was the oppression of the black community by the police? Minnesota Attorney General Keith Ellison was asked in a 60 Minutes interview, which is my next video, why the case was not prosecuted as a hate crime when, quote, all the world sees it as a white officer killing a black man. All the world, this is his words. Ellison admitted there was no evidence of racial animus. By framing the entire horrific event as an oppressor group versus an oppressed group, it took a cultural Marxist angle, and I would suggest further divided society by doing what? Pitting one group against another. And that was from the reporter himself here. All right, let me see if I can get this to the right spot.
The murder.
Yep, right here. Whoops, no.
Was this a hate crime?
I wouldn't call it that, because hate crimes are crimes where there's an explicit motive and of bias. We don't have any evidence that Derek Chauvin factored in George Floyd's race as he did what he did.
You could have charged him with a hate crime under Minnesota law, and you chose not to.
Could have, but we only charged those crimes that we had evidence that we could put in front of a jury to prove. If we'd have had a witness that told us that Derek Chauvin made a racial reference, we might have charged him with a hate crime. But I would have needed a witness to say that on the stand. We didn't have it, so we didn't do it.
The whole world sees this as a white officer killing a black man because he is black. And you're telling me that there's no evidence to support that?
In our society, there is a social norm that killing certain kinds of people is more tolerable than other kinds of people.
Okay. And he's going to go into this. This is a very interesting. You can watch, by the way, all these things on YouTube if you just put in something like this. And he's going to go into the idea, and this is going to take us to the next gentleman we're going to meet by the name of Ibram Kendi, that the idea is racism is something you cannot unteach because it is in your best interest to be racist. So he's going to say here, meaning you, meaning people who are white, that it is in your best interest to be racist, so you can't unteach it. Now, of course, what does our Christian faith teach us? Racism is it's abhorrent. And it's abhorrent precisely because God created and redeemed each person. Okay? That God created and redeemed each person. And you're actually sinning with racism against the very base things that our God has done. Remember our Galatians verse. In Jesus Christ, there is neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. These things before God are they're irrelevant in our standing before Him. But the idea here is, and we're going to get to it, so if you can't teach people out of it, what we're going to try to do is just make policies. That then the policies, the goal of the policies, and hopefully we get this, the goal of the policies is to create, with the letter E, equality, or if you will, equity of the forced. So, I need to introduce you to a guy by the name of Ibram Kendi, because you need to know this man. Now, Ibram Kendi, he has the very, very famous book. This is not his most famous book. This is not a meme either, though. This is a real book. He wrote a book called How to Be an Anti-Racist. And this is required reading on basically 80% of college campuses, along with another lady by the name of Robin DiAngelo, who wrote a book called White Fragility. Have any of you heard of either of these books? Okay. Now, I'm going to tell you about the books, but before that, I want to show you. Anti-Racist Baby is his first kid's book. So this is a real book. This is like a core, those big, thick books with a cardboard that your children chew on. So this is a real book, and the like. But I want to tell you here, in a recent interview, what he did. And this gets to how Kendi understands Christianity versus what he's going to call liberation theology, and what Jesus is, and the like, and how this works. What we're going to tell you again, it's pure Marxism. All right, so I want to show you a video here of him talking about the church. And you're going to listen to what is racist here. Oops. Here we go. So that's Kendi. By the way, I actually have, that I've read here, I have this book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, which is unfailingly honest. If nothing else, I mean, he is very honest about his entire journey in life with how he perceives racism, which is ever evolving. Okay, very, very interesting read. I agree with almost nothing in it, but it is in fact incredibly interesting. All right, but just watch this critique of Christianity and what he would like to see happen instead.
I'm curious if you see any role that churches or communities of faith can play in this anti-racist movement.
Sure. So I'm a preacher's kid, and my parents pretty much met in what was known as the Black Power movement, but more specifically for them, the movement for Black theology. And so they were both Christians who imagined that the church was supposed to be an engine of liberation, that Christianity was supposed to be a source of liberation for Black people and humanity. They looked at Jesus as Black with a fro, like they had their fros. And what I sort of ultimately realized in analyzing the form of Christianity that they were raised in, particularly during the Black theology movement, and sort of just, I should say, contrasting that with the form of Christianity that 80% of white evangelicals have when they voted for Donald Trump. I think one of the ways we can distinguish it is one being liberation theology. In other words, Jesus was a revolutionary. And the job of the Christian is to revolutionize society. That the job of the Christian is to liberate society from...
Okay, so Jesus is a revolutionary, and the job of the Christian church is to do what? Revolutionize society. That's our purpose and function. This is one thing, what he calls liberation theology. Keep reading or listening here.
From the powers on earth that are oppressing humanity. Everybody understand that? So that's liberation theology in a nutshell. Savior theology is a different type of theology. The job of the Christian is to go out and save these individuals who are behaviorally deficient. In other words,
I like that. On Sunday, I've actually taken out for our liturgy that I confess I am by nature sinful and unclean. I put in, I confess that I am behaviorally deficient. I dig that. So this is Savior theology. Go out and save these folks who are behaviorally deficient, of course, what we would call simply sinful.
words, we're to bring them into the church, these individuals who are doing all of these evil, sinful things, and heal them and save them. And then once we've saved them, we've done our jobs. And to me, anti-racists fundamentally reject Savior theology. That goes right in line with racist ideas and racist theology in which they...
Are you catching this? So it goes along with, because calling somebody to repent of their sins is in of itself being oppressive. Okay.
Say, you know what? Black people, other racial groups, the reason why they're struggling on earth is because of what they're behaviorally doing wrong. And it is my job as the pastor to sort of save these wayward black people, or wayward poor people, or wayward queer people. That type of theology breeds bigotry.
So it's not just that it's oppressive, it's actually breeding. In other words, calling someone to repentance is actually a four-letter word that starts with the letter E. Evil. It's actually evil. And breeding bigotry. Because you're not speaking from a place from the truth of God's word. Every single thing is looked at as a power dynamic, which then prevents conversation and talking to one another and listening even. Every single thing, and this is taught, again, 80% of colleges.
And so to me, the type of theology, of liberation theology, breeds a common humanity against the structures of power that oppress us all.
I love that. A common humanity against the powers, except for the people on the other side. We have a common humanity.
I'm curious.
Okay. Any questions thus far before I get to a couple more Kendi quotes here for you to understand what's this? Yeah.
So he's not talking about liberation from sin, like it's liberation from societal and governmental structure.
Yes, absolutely, because that is the problem. Everything is oppressive. So I want to give you a quote here from Kendi. I just want you to listen to this one here. This is very important. The only remedy to racist discrimination is, now think about how you might answer that as a Christian. The only remedy to racist discrimination is, how would we answer that as Christians? Jesus is a really good answer. I always like, honestly, it's like you have a children's message in front of the church. How often is the answer Jesus? It actually almost applies all through life. Just keep answering Jesus, you got a 90% shot at it. Jesus. It is forgiveness in the new hearts that we have, and being able to see the world, okay, through the lens of what Jesus Christ has done for us and all people, and who that person is in Christ. And do we have an answer to this? The only remedy to racist discrimination, we have something to say as Christians. Something beautiful, I might add. His answer. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination, which means anti-racist, here's a word that I'd like you to write down. Okay, if you got a pen, this is important to know. An anti-racist is one who fights against a system of racism. Not against just racism, a system where you're seeing all of it as system. One who fights against a system. Everything is seen in terms of then group dynamics and all those things. So in other words, I had a gentleman in my Bible class who had minority children that he had adopted and loved with all of his heart. And he actually got kind of emotional in our class too, talking about this. He can love his children with all of his heart and still be considered a racist if he does not get on board with fighting against a system of racism. So you could say, wait, I love all people. And the response will only come back, well, that just proves you're a racist. Unless you see all the world as a power dynamic, that's well, you'd be labeled. Yes?
I'm just curious if there's been anything published or written about how this affects children of mixed racial marriages. So then, which parent is the oppressor? And how guilty should that child feel? I don't, like, how do they...
Kendi talks, it's funny, Kendi actually talks about that in his book a little bit in regard to, this is very interesting, how this is viewed by shades of your skin color and how people are treated differently even by shades. And his illustration is in regard to a girl, like, I mean, I'm not going to go into it, but yeah, I don't know if I would say there was something specifically published on how that works in terms of a power dynamic and the like, but there certainly is. I even have a video on how people are judged according to shade, even, which is, again, compare that to how Christ would have us. Yeah.
If you go to the Holocaust Museum in Skopje, you can see a table, and it shows, I think it's down to like a 16th or 32nd, what percentage of Jewish or non-Jewish blood you have, and therefore how the German government is supposed to treat you.
Yep. Yeah. Amazing. Amazing. Yeah.
I know I'm maybe going a little off topic here, but when we're talking about critical race theory in schools, and now the argument that they're not teaching critical race theory, that the CRT they're teaching is culturally responsive teaching, and how that relates, they have things like diversity, equity, inclusion departments, and that sort of thing, and how they're covering their tracks and arguing that they're not teaching critical race theory.
One of the, sometimes it might be honest and sometimes it's not. Where, what I mean by that is there are some people who might say, well, we're not teaching any form of Marxism, literally not knowing any of the background as to where this all came from. So some people may not know, but it doesn't change the fact that what the actual application of the teaching is, I would say, is in fact pure modern cultural form of Marxism, and the results of it are evil. You see what I'm saying? So some people may not know, just don't know.
Do you tie in, like, for example, using those words, those keywords, those...
Yeah, the buzzwords of...
Right, I mean, all the buzzwords that you use for culturally responsive teaching are the same as critical race theory and Marxism. Is it why, but they mean something different? Is that what we're...
Nobody, okay, so let's take the big one. Black Lives Matter. This will kind of illustrate some things. I believe a lot of people join Black Lives Matter because Black Lives Matter. Okay? In fact, I would say a vast, vast, vast majority that they saw them and said, we want to say that Black Lives Matter. The leaders of Black Lives Matter are all avowed what? Marxists. And actually say we use Marxist tactics and the like. So I make a distinction in my Bible study between the leadership and then people who join, which, by the way, also speaks to the fact that basically a lot of people just want to be good people, quote, do the right thing. And Marxism, what I said, it kind of, look, we're for the oppressed. We're for the oppressed. Except it brings people in. This, by the way, creates a great challenge for our witnessing, which is going to be my last segment on witnessing. When you're witnessing because they're the good people and you are the bad person, for a word has been spoken. Now, what question was I answering here? I kind of got going. This is classic pastor right here.
How is it being covered in schools?
Well, that's just it. So they can have the out saying it's not Marxism, when in fact, I don't know what to say. It is. it is. Yeah.
Could you define system of racism for us?
Well, the system is basically seeing then all of society as oppressive. So, for instance, can I give you an example, and maybe I can get to a good definition? How many of you have heard of the 1619 Project? The 1619 Project is the idea that America actually began in 1619 with the first slaves, and thus this proves that all of America is based upon slavery or oppression, a general category of oppression. All right? So therefore, the entire system is bad. So when I was growing up, both in public school and in Lutheran school, I was both taught equally about the evils of racism. Okay? I was taught, it didn't matter where I was, that's what I was taught. But I did not learn about the system. Was not something that I was necessarily taught at that time, and I had to learn what this was. This was all part of the learning. But the idea then is that proves, that's the original sin, and it proves then that there is a system that exists that pervades every entity of human life. I don't know if I defined it well, but it's literally everything is a system. The various institutions. Name an institution, it is racist. And I know we get caught up on racism, but I'm going to keep saying to you, it's not just race, it's all the other categories of oppression as well. Like again, my teachers, they were being taught about heterosexual oppression. But it's every institution and where you find a power structure. That's it. I like that definition. It's where you find a power structure in every institution that exists. Systemic oppression. I need to keep reading this quote, though, on Kendi. I got to go back to Kendi. The only remedy to racist discrimination is anti-racist discrimination. This is going to get great. The only remedy to past discrimination is present discrimination. The only remedy to present discrimination is future discrimination. Because you need to discriminate to bring people down to achieve. So this was a great quote I saw. Insofar as Kendi's books speak for modern anti-racism, it should be praised for clarifying what the anti really means. Fundamentally, the anti-race movement is not against discrimination. It is against inequity, which in many cases makes it pro-discrimination. So take one close to home. I saw that here in Chicago you had the Museum of Art, and recently I think they laid off 150 ladies. Fired them? Yeah, I shouldn't say laid off, fired them, because they did not achieve, they didn't have enough equity of race. So by they actually then discriminated against these white ladies, in large part, to achieve. So in other words, this is exactly what Kendi is saying. In the end, to achieve racial equity is actually pro-discrimination. Do you see how that works? Okay, so I have a great Bible study on this. What's my time here, Paul? Are we done? We're way over it?
Soon.
Well, how much time do we have left? What do we have?
You make the call. What do you want?
Well, how long do we go to at the end?
We go till 12:30.
12:30. Can we do like a 7-minute break? Is that enough for a break and start at 11:35? And
Yes.
then I'll bring it home with how do we respond to this and one last little bit on racism too.
Yep.
All right, very good.